Molweni Mkhaya. I hope that you are well and in good spirits. Thank you for joining this discourse on land in South Africa. This recording is in response to an episode on the Penuel show pertaining to the contentious issue of land in South Africa. I'm not going to repeat what Penuel said in the episode itself. Instead, I'm going to cherry pick a few things that I feel are important and necessary for us to continue in without necessarily having to be bogged down in the things that I believe are irrelevant, like the current land ownership reality in South Africa. As an African who was born in South Africa and who has lived here all my life, I've traveled a bit of Southern Africa. I've traveled in a bit of East Africa, Tanzania, specifically in Zanzibar. I've been to Morocco, which is another issue that we seldom talk about, but that was another colonial project, but I'm not going to touch on that one right now necessarily in any kind of detail. But within my presentation, for lack of a better word, I want you to include the Arab colonies on the northern coast of Africa. Penuel begins the episode from a philosophical departure point, which I don't think is philosophical really. I feel like it is more real than the human constructs that he alludes to. Land truly cannot belong to anybody, because the land itself came before you, it precedes human beings, and the land will be here after every individual has passed on and becomes an ancestor. The importance of this particular point is because of the fact that when we discuss how to move forward in South Africa, and indeed the entire African continent, we must bear in mind that we are only ever stewards. We are only ever here for a short period of time, and what we do with the land is that we steward the land. We can't own it. If anything, human beings have made the mistake, particularly because of European civilization, the way that the European thinks, the way that the European sees the world, the way that the European makes sense of the world and gives meaning to the experiences of human beings. In European civilization, we don't consider ourselves a part of nature. For some reason, because of our level of consciousness, we feel like we are somehow separate from nature when we are not. Just like the cats and the dogs you have as pets, just like the wild animals in the Kruger National Park or in the Serengeti, just like the trees and the plants that we consume are a part of nature, so are we as human beings. And with that in mind, what we should be pursuing is ecology. An ecosystem is a specified territory, including water, including land, including oceans, including trees and animals, and all of this forms life. When, as human beings, we talk about life being unfair, which is what every African will tell you, life is unfair. And Europeans will say, but yes, that's a matter of fact. It's untrue that life is unfair. What is unfair is human beings. A part of nature, a part of life, but not life itself. Human beings are unfair. And human beings being unfair is the reason that we have conflicts. So this idea of ownership, of individual land rights, disturbs ecology. And it creates a situation that some forms of life are considered to be superior to others. Human beings consider themselves superior to animals or to plants because we're able to dominate them. And this is problematic because human beings disturb ecology. So in his introduction, Penuel speaks of this philosophical concept as he talks about it. But for me, it is more real than anything else. The land was here before you got here. The land will be here after you're gone. Trees were here before you, and they will be here after you're gone. Of course, unless we do what we have been doing, which is to kill all forms of life, including water, things that we can't do without as living beings, whether human, whether animal, whether you're a plant. So on this philosophical idea, philosophy itself is a construct. It's human reasoning, trying to make sense of things that were here long before we were here. So that's the first point that I want to deal with. It is not a philosophy that land does not belong to anybody. The land was here before you. If anything, you belong to the land, which is why we are called Africans, because we are named after the land in which we were born. In modern society, we have this construct of an economy, which is essentially the means of production, which is how we put food on the table, how we build walls, ceilings, windows, doors, roofs to ensure that we are warm, that we are safe, that we can live, which is the point of being, is to live and to replenish life, which is why we give birth, and all forms of life give birth. So this construct of an economy isn't intended to make one person superior to another. It is not intended to create comfort for one at the expense of another, whether it be another human, whether it be another form of life, as a plant or an animal. So I just want to ground us in reality, which is that this idea of land ownership should more be viewed as land stewardship with the purpose of perpetuating life, so that we can come to a fuller understanding of our being, our nature, and our purpose. Penuel goes on to delve into history. He speaks about life and migration, which is where conflicts have arisen historically. Of course, conflicts arise as a consequence of human nature, where one person has something and another person wants that thing, and then conflict arises, or a community shares something, and one faction of the community believes that this thing should be utilized in a particular way, and another faction believes it should be utilized in a different way, and then conflict arises. So migration is something that creates a more spontaneous and natural conflict, because if you can imagine, as a human being, whether you are Khoi or San or Nguni, and these Europeans arrive and they have their own interests at heart, and their interests are to take what is in this land for the perpetuation of life where they come from. You must remember, in this specific instance of the Europeans, that Europe is one of the poorest places in the world. The natural conditions in Europe are not conducive for life with the expansion of the population, and it hasn't been for the longest time. I mean, Europeans have grown exponentially, obviously, over the years, but once resources became scarce, they started warring with each other. And when it became clear that even if there was peace, there still wouldn't be enough for everybody, they then started exploring further. Now, there's this idea that Europeans discovered lands. They discovered Africa. They discovered the Middle East. But if you look at the map of the world that Penuel argues is inaccurate, when I was in Morocco, in Tangiers specifically, on my second trip to Morocco, I had stood at the coast, and across the water you could see Europe. Europe has always been known to Africa, just as Africa has always been known to Europe. The same way that the Middle East has always been known to Africa, and Africa has been known to the Middle East, because you can literally walk across Egypt and go into the Middle East. So the Europeans didn't discover anything. The Europeans knew what they were doing when they left Europe, and they started conquering the rest of the world. Now, in South Africa, Jan van Riebeeck arrived here in 1652. 10 years earlier, they had built the castle in Ghana, which was then the Gold Coast, where they were transporting slaves. Unbeknownst to us, our ancestors here in Southern Africa, when they arrived here, they already had colonial conquest in mind. And whereas we had integrated and we had exchanged, traded with the Europeans, when I say we, I'm referring to our ancestors, it wasn't an immediate conflict. It wasn't. They came here under the auspices of trade. They came here to investigate life here so that they could then formulate a strategy of warfare. So for me, when I look at the issue of land and the present land ownership and the dispossession of land, I don't find it to be a complex issue. I find it to be very simple. In my legal studies, there's a principle that we are taught, which is causa sine qua non, the but-for test. The but-for test looks at an injury that is caused to one person by other people, and it asks the question, what would have been the reality had this one person who caused the harm not intervened in the life of the person who suffered the harm? And if Europeans had not landed in South Africa, we would not have had any land issues that we are discussing right now. There may have been different land issues, but we can't even discuss that right now. The reality is Europeans shifted African reality forever. Restitution and restoration means taking an injured party and returning them to the state that they were in prior to the injury or the harm caused to them. And so I believe that the land issue in South Africa is quite a complex, quite a simple one, in the sense that everything in South Africa belongs to those who were here prior to Europeans arriving. How we move forward may be complex, but how we got here, very simple. Europeans arrived with the intention of causing harm to the existing African population, which is the Khoi, the San, and the Ntu, the Abantu, the Ngunis. Obviously, when you go a little further up north, you've got some different branches, but let's just talk about Africans for simplicity. Everybody who was here prior to European arrival was African. Now, I'm not talking about the Arabs, because they were colonizers as well. They still are colonial settlers in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Morocco, and in Egypt. When they talk about the migration of the Nguni people, they say that we came from Central and Northern Africa. Now, why would we have moved from that territory and have come all the way down to the south is quite clear, because we were removed from those territories. So as far as I'm concerned, even the Arab belt of Africa still needs to be restored to Africans. But that's not the subject of the conversation. At this present moment, we're discussing South African land. Again, it's a very difficult one because it's very relevant. We cannot afford to lose any more of who we are and what we had as Africans. So when we're talking about the history of land in South Africa, for me, it's quite simple. Go back to the beginning of the very issue that we're discussing, and you go back to 1652. Conflicts allegedly began around 1656 or somewhere around there. But because the intent was always there to cause the harm and the damage, let's go back to 1652. Let's restore stewardship of Africa to those who were in Africa prior to the European arrival and also prior to the Arab invasions on the northern continent. Which leaves in this particular conversation, this discourse, all Africans, wherever they are in the world, are relevant to this conversation. Whether you are on the continent or whether you are in the diaspora, you should take an interest in this conversation because you are the descendant of Africans, which means that you have as much claim and interest in the conversation about land in South Africa as those of us who have been born here and have lived here all of our lives. I feel like at this point I've dispensed with the complexities which brings us to a place of, okay, so now the land belongs to Africans. Africans and African descendants all over the world are the stewards of African land. What do we do now? We know for a fact that the Arabs will not give the land back without a fight. We know that the Europeans will not give the land back without a fight. So what are we to do as Africans? Because we've already seen what NATO does. When NATO does not like what anybody around the world does that disturbs their interests in the rest of the world. Now this brings us back to Kwame Nkrumah, who is the father of African civilization in modern times. He was the individual, the first Ghanaian president, the first state to be independent of colonial rule. When he received, or at least when the Ghanaian people received their independence, the very first thing that Kwame Nkrumah said was, until all Africans are free, us as Ghanaians are not free. What Kwame Nkrumah was doing was identifying with every African on the continent and in the diaspora. Kwame Nkrumah understood that the land of Africa belongs to all of the people of Africa, cognizant of the fact that in the Berlin Conference, the land was divided with the specific intention of not just distributing it to the different parts of Europe, but more specifically of ensuring that there would not be a uniform uprising from the people of Africa. Because if that had happened, the Europeans would have been screwed because we outnumbered them too many to none. So where Penuel seeks to accommodate Europeans in this discourse, I completely and utterly believe that they should not be a part of the conversation at all. I believe that the Indians and the Malays who were brought here as slaves have more interest and right to the lands that they came from, being Malaysia, being Pakistan, being India, than they do in South Africa. And they should be a part of the conversations there before they are a part of the conversation here. In the same way that I believe that the African descendants who are in the diaspora have more of an interest in the conversation about land and life and society in Africa before those who are here presently. One of the biggest failures of the ANC government is that it has taken this long for us to integrate meaningfully into the continent. And I'm saying this long because the strides of the African passport, which is something which is still in motion and still hasn't come out, is something that is in the minds of many Africans, something that many of us welcome, something that we're excited about. Things like the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is something that is extraordinarily exciting for me as an African. The idea of, even though the passport of Africa hasn't been rolled out, that some countries are already removing visa requirements for African citizens. And this is creating a greater sense of unity with, for me at least, with Africans outside of the colonial borders of South Africa. It is crucial and important for us to cling with everything we have to the African identity before we talk about nation states and national identities. I believe the key and the secret to Africa's future and future African civilizations lies in the African identity, not national identities, and even less so in tribal identities. In the same way that I feel like if the rest of the people of the world had Ubuntu, human solidarity, or identifying as a human being without having any discriminatory, hierarchical affiliations to something, I wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Before I'm an African, I'm a human being. And if we looked at the whole world as the environment in which all human beings have their being, and as such we would deal with each other equitably, I would not be making this recording right now. We would not be having this discourse on land in South Africa, which for me is a discourse on land in Africa as a whole. And so as much as I appreciate the research that Penuel has done into the history of land in South Africa, I feel like it is the wrong departure point. Because as we know, Europeans have destroyed our history. They have distorted it where they have not been able to destroy it. And the distortion comes in the form of Christianity. It comes in the form of Islam, which again has separated Africa in two, with the northern parts being primarily Islam and Muslim, and the southern parts of the African continent being Christian. And those two religions have created a distortion of spirituality, which is just life. Spirituality isn't supposed to be something that is separate from your ability to eat. Indeed, the Bible speaks of your body being a temple. What you put into it is a form of worship. So I want us to forget about European cognition and European sensibilities, European ways of seeing the world and ascribing meaning to phenomenon in the world. And I want us to just settle into a reality where the land belongs to nobody. We are merely stewards of it. And I want us to return to this idea of Ubuntu, where a human being is a human being for being's sake, for life's sake. And I want us to return to this concept of isdima in Xhosa, which is, some say that it's dignity. I tend to take a different view of it. For me, it is gravitas. Gravitas being a grounding in the seriousness of life. The fact that there is an interplay between elements, and istima is the wisdom to understand what perpetuates life, what integrates life, what creates an ecology, which is the trait that leaders are supposed to have. People with wisdom, people who can see further into the future than other people because they have a cognition. They're able to make sense of the elements and the phenomenon and the interplay between the various forms of life and non-life that perpetuate life. When we think about moving forward as South Africans, we need to look at ourselves as Africans, because in that we're able to better understand not just the motives of the European descendants that colonized us, or the Arab descendants that colonized us, or rather the ancestors of Europeans who colonized us, and the ancestors of the Arabs who colonized us, who now consider themselves a part of Africans, whether as Afrikaners or as Moroccans or as, I mean, the English speaking South Africans don't even attempt to make themselves African in any way, shape, or form. But that's just a part of the British arrogance. I mean, again, my grandfather is a British descendant, or was a British descendant, and so I have the blood of the guilty in me. Obviously, as you can see, I'm an African, so I'm moving forward from that identity. One of the most important things about looking at the future of Africa is that we have to believe in our ability as Africans to govern ourselves and to be good stewards of not just the land, but of life on the land. In a time where the whole world is embroiled in some form of a conflict, whether it is a domestic conflict or an international conflict, the whole world is restless. The whole world is restless. The whole world is built on this hierarchical European cognition and sensibility, which is absurd when you look at it from an ecological perspective. Because how is one form of life more important than another? Surely it can't be. It is a known fact that without bees, life would suffer. How is a human being superior in any way, shape, or form to a bee then? How is a human being in any way, shape, or form superior to a plant that sustains the very being of a human? I don't think this conversation is a very complex one. I feel like it's relatively simple. And when we look forward and we look at African unity, fine, now we're united as Africans. What are we united in? What does African civilization look like? What are we working towards? What are we supposed to dedicate ourselves to individually, as families, as communities, as smaller parts of African society, whether it be in Southern Africa, in Central Africa, in East Africa, or in West Africa, and eventually in North Africa, once we reclaim the land there as well? How should we govern ourselves? Is democracy truly the best form of governance? The people of the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, would beg to differ. Because in their kingdoms, their native people are flourishing. If you look at China, if you look at their economy, if you look at their progress over the last 50 years, they would beg to differ. If you look at Scandinavian Europe, with their socialistic democracy, you will find that they would beg to differ, that capitalism and an unfettered free market system is not superior. So as Africans, it's not like we have to start from a clean slate. It's not like we have to reinvent the wheel. There are plenty of modalities out there that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that capitalism and democracy are not the ultimate form of civilization. In fact, if you look at the state of free market democracies, you will find that there is more conflict in them and caused by them than any other form of government that I've mentioned. You don't see the Arab people waging war for resources. You don't see the Scandinavian European people waging war for resources. You don't see the Chinese people with all of their firepower waging war for resources. Yet America is continuously, with the aid of the NATO states, continuously causing so much suffering all around the world. Steve Biko spoke about Black consciousness, which is essentially where Africans take their focus and attention off of the European colonial settlers and the colonists and the empirical god of NATO, and focusing on ourselves, focusing on cultivating our humanity, focusing on appreciating our legacy, our heritage. He advocates for rebuilding ourselves as individuals with istima, so that we can create families that are supportive and conducive for our safety and well-being, and integrating our families into communities that can further support the individual to fulfill their potential and their purpose. And if you look at how people like Upiko, like Robert Sebukwe, like a Thomas Sankara, like a Patrice Lumumba, like a Kwame Nkrumah, have been so viciously hunted and murdered by European civilization, you start realizing that what they do want is for us to be involved in conversations like the one that Penuel is having. Whereas a person like myself is just like, forget about the Europeans. Forget about their systems. Forget about their way of seeing life. Forget about what they believe is true and real. Forget about all of it. Forget about them in totality. Just forget about Europeans. Look at the person who looks like you, the person who shares your history and your heritage and your trauma, and look at that person with love and compassion and empathy, and do everything in your power to consolidate and integrate yourself with that person, sharing with that person the healing capacity that you have, sharing with that person the means of production that you have, sharing with that person the ideals that you have, and then working with that person to realize those ideals that you have in common. I don't think the land issue in South Africa and Africa is a complex one. I feel like it is made complex by our inferiority complex, which was created by the very European who created their supremacy by dominating our ancestors. So I think I'm going to cap it there for now. I feel like I'm getting a little emotional and I'm getting a little sidetracked. But the crux of the matter is this. Land on the African continent belongs to every descendant of Africa, whether they are on the continent or in the diaspora. And the sooner we stop judging each other through the lens of European cognition and sensibility, where we start comparing who has what and then concluding that this one is better than the other. There's no need for that. There is enough wealth on the African continent to feed the whole world. There's enough resources on the African continent to create a conducive environment for all of life on the continent and pretty much for the whole world. What we need to discard in ourselves is the way that the European views the world, whether it be Christianity, whether it be capitalism, whether it be a free market system, Once you get to a place of humanity, then yes, of course, every human being matters and their voice matters. So democracy is a matter of fact when you operate with Ubuntu, because it's not about dominance. It's about ecology. Even Europeans will find themselves living in a much more conducive world once they relinquish all of the lands that they have stolen from so many people around the world, whether it be Africa, whether it be Australasia, whether it be the Americas. If they just give it back and allow the sensibilities and the cognition of those people to steward the lands, Europe will have an abundance from the overflow of those lands. And so if you're still trying to affirm your dignity as a human being, it is because you are not operating as an African. You are operating as a Black. You are operating as a Negro. You are operating as a Khalid. You are operating as a Kafir. You are operating as a Busman, or whatever other title the European has bestowed upon you. And if you're still pursuing development as an African state, you are trying to develop to what? To European standards. For what? When Europe in and of itself is perpetually insecure. All of the conflicts that they have waged around the world has made them resented by people. And again, if you're trying and aspiring to being European, it's because you're operating from their cognition. It's exactly what they want. So when Penuel explores different modalities and the Zulu kingdom and Misizulu having 1 million hectares of the 2.6 million hectares that has been bestowed upon the Zulu nation, and playing around with taxes and this, that, and the other, I'm just like, you're still living according to European civilization. You're still aspiring to being white. When your African inheritance and your African heritage makes you far superior in every way, shape, or form. Not because as a human being you're superior, but because of the cognition and the sensibilities of Ubuntu and esteem. I thank you again for joining this discourse. I invite you to comment. I invite you to debate. I invite you to reason on this topic, whether it be this recording or the recording of the Penuel show that has sparked my involvement in this discourse on land in South Africa, which I feel like is a narrow view and short-sighted, and should be a conversation about African civilization, African society, African modes of cognition, and African sensibilities. If you want to understand what I mean about African cognition and sensibilities, Dr. Lwazi Lushaba, he's a lecturer of political science at the University of Cape Town, has contributed in a beautiful way to the feelings that I've always had about being African, and has given me an understanding of those particular concepts. If you want to understand what civilization is, you can look that up in the dictionary. It's pretty self-explanatory. It is the highest form of development that a particular group of people in a territory have achieved. Now, in Africa, you will hear about African civilization in the form of ancient African civilizations, because again, African history was disturbed by European civilization. So please do engage in this conversation. The government of national unity in South Africa threatens to reverse all of the gains that Africans have made over the centuries fighting against the Europeans. And over the next 4 or 5 years, it is important for us as Africans in South Africa to consolidate ourselves and to crystallize our identity as Africans and to charter a path forward for us. And just as it is important for us as South Africans to do that, we need to open ourselves up to the rest of the African continent and to Africans across the diaspora, because those kin of ours are the key to us having the resources we need to be able to build a future for ourselves that doesn't need Europeans or Chinese or Russians or anybody else. Again, thank you for listening in on this discourse. Please engage. Please share your thoughts and views and your beliefs and your ideals for where you would like us to go as an African people, as an African society, and as the rightful stewards of African soil. I greet you Ngobuntu in the name of all of our ancestors. And I hope that this discourse will enrich your life in a way that allows you to reconnect with your inherent dignity as a human being and as an African. Take care.